Welcome, and thank you for tuning in. You're listening to the Beyond 50 radio program. I'm Daniel Davis. Many of our veterans, as they return from foreign wars and even coming across from overseas, suffer a lot of post-traumatic stress disorder from the experiences that they've had. Many times they find it very difficult, in some cases perhaps even impossible, to integrate themselves back into what we term here in America as a normal way of living. On the program today, we're going to be talking with Jim Larson of Project Welcome Home Troops. We're going to be talking about how this particular project helps to relieve stress by producing workshops for veterans that offer natural and alternative methods of addressing post-traumatic stress disorder. We're also going to be talking about the research that's done on the practices, success stories, and the future of this program. Jim has a master's degree in education from Southern Illinois University. He has been teaching stress relief practices to the general population for more than 37 years, and more recently, specialized programs for stress relief to groups with cancer, depression, combat trauma, and disaster survivors in Haiti. I'd like to welcome to the Beyond 50 radio program today our guest, Mr. Jim Larson. Jim, how are you today?
I'm great, Daniel. Thanks for having me on.
You know, it's such a wonderful pleasure to know, because you hear so little about this out there, about how we're actually trying to bring our veterans back into the fold. You know, you look at the past wars, and they seem like big deals, and, you know, now we're to this urban sort of warfare, war in Afghanistan, and it's almost as though they're being forgotten here, and that's not such a good thing.
No, it's not. But particularly when you look at the numbers, I don't think people realize how many men and women served in Iraq and Afghanistan. It's somewhere in between like 2 and 3 million.
Mm-hmm.
They weren't all there at one time, but remember the war went on for 10 years in Iraq, and it still hasn't wound down in Afghanistan yet.
Mm-hmm. It seems to have exceeded Vietnam by all the numbers.
Yeah.
Now, tell us about this program and how this all got started.
Well, there were a few teachers who had been teaching stress relief practices and meditation and yoga type of practices for many years, and they had seen the need of just reading the newspaper articles about the veterans, and the idea came that these practices certainly could be helpful, for people in that situation. And so they contacted someone who was really an expert in working with veterans, and that was a man named Dr. Shad Mashad, who had been working with veterans since the 1970s. And he set up an organization called the National Veterans Foundation. And he was told about what we had, and he thought it was a great idea. So those teachers contacted me and a few others, and we met. We spent a weekend with Dr. Mashad, and he trained us in understanding the issues around post-traumatic stress, and then he helped us design a workshop which integrated the practices we were using in a format that would work well with veterans. And so we've been doing that workshop now for about the last 7 years.
Now, you mentioned yoga. Now, the name came across my desk of a Sri Ravi Shankar. Does that name kind of fall into the fold with this?
Yeah, there's several different practices that we use on the workshop, but there's one practice in particular that's really the most effective, and it's called Sudarshan Kriya Yoga. Mm-hmm. And it comes from Sri Ravi Shankar, who's a teacher from India, and that's the main practice that we teach the veterans on the workshop, and then when they leave the workshop, it's something they can do at home.
Well, I just, when I heard that name, it kind of hit me, because I actually, when I was in Portland, Oregon, had the opportunity to meet and sit in on, I don't know if you'd really call it a talk as much as a guy that sat in front of about 1,800 people in his pajamas and got everybody into a meditation. I thought, there's a lifestyle. But it was quite interesting to hear about something like that being integrated into something like post-traumatic stress disorder, where it seems that, looking back at how we were dealing with that in years past, it was more like one-on-one or group therapy traditional sessions. And it seems like it's starting to take a turn to look at more natural alternatives that seem to be working probably better. Would that be fair to say?
Well, I think that's definitely true. In the East, particularly in India, for thousands of years, there was a focus on everyone using natural mind-body practices just to keep themselves healthy and stress-free. And of course, then there were all others who took it further, where the focus on meditation and these kinds of practices was actually done to develop their full potential, which they referred to as enlightenment.
Mm-hmm.
But wherever you're at in life, the practices are going to be, extremely valuable. And in the West, was a tendency, not to focus on mind-body practices, but instead of focus on medications typically. And so the veterans coming back with post-traumatic stress, in the typical Western fashion, they're just being given medication and some counseling. But for many, that has not proved to be very effective at all.
Mm-hmm.
Many veterans I've spoke to say, they tried medications, but the side effects are just, not very good, and they don't want to take them, and yet they're still looking for help.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why we offer them these mind-body practices so that they can do it in a natural way without the side effects. And one of the things they appreciate the most is it's something that they can control on their own. Once they've taken the workshop, they do the work at home. Mm-hmm. They don't need anyone to help them. They don't have to talk about their memories, and which is another big issue for them. They don't really like sitting through counseling and having to, bring up the memories from the past. And
not to mention probably sitting there and having somebody try to get them to analyze why they feel that way. That's just crazy.
Yeah, it's not to discount, therapy altogether, because some of the older veterans that I've met, the Vietnam era veterans, who've been out of the war for 40 years, have told me that that the counseling that they got, it did help them reintegrate into life to the point where they became more stable, were able to, hold a job and, have basic, function in life. But they never really got over the post-traumatic stress from the counseling or from medication.
Mm-hmm. Now, how did you decide to get involved with this? There must have been something that inspired you to move in this direction with your life.
Well, I think it was the same for all of us who are doing the work. Is we read the stories in the paper about what was going on, and we knew that what we were teaching is something that would work. For any veteran who's willing to take the time to learn the practices and then do them at home, we knew it would work and it wouldn't have the kind of side effects that the other treatments were having. And I think this is proving true. There are other groups that are also working with veterans with other types of meditation and yoga and these kinds of things. And all of this is being a tremendous help.
Mm-hmm. Now, if you can, for our listeners, a lot of people have an idea what post-traumatic stress disorder is, but give us an idea of some of the things, for instance, our most recent veterans returning home have really experienced, to kind of put this into context so people understand better.
Well, post-traumatic stress, it results from, it could be just a single traumatic incident, or it could be something that builds up from, like being, living for a year in a war zone, and your life is constantly being threatened. You're seeing other people being hurt or killed, or maybe you've been blown up. And going through these types of experiences, it leaves a deep impression in the system. And coming back from that, it's like it doesn't just go away on its own. It's a much deeper type of stress, and it results in a chronic sense of anxiety, and the people, they shut down emotionally. Often they get very depressed. They have insomnia. They have outbursts of anger, and they say that the trauma from the war, it haunts them every single day. And then it also then spreads to their families, because you can imagine if you're living with somebody who's going through those kinds of things, everyone in the house is going to be affected. Mm-hmm. Because they get triggered for no reason at all. There's nothing going on, but all of a sudden, they're reacting in a way as if as if they're in danger. I've heard many stories of veterans are just driving down the road, and there's be something in the road, just some piece of trash or whatever, and right away their mind thinks, okay, it could be a bomb, and so there's an instant reaction, even though they're back home in America and everything is safe. But the impression in the mind is so strong that it brings that type of a reaction out.
Mm-hmm. I know a lot of times people tend to see families break apart, sometimes in devastating ways as a result of something like this.
Yeah, well, you can imagine, how difficult it is when the person is going through the anxiety or depression and outbursts of anger, and also, they don't want to talk about it, and so they're not sharing how they feel, and a spouse then, feels disconnected and isolated from them, and so it's very difficult for the marriages and the families.
Now, as you've implemented this program here, what kind of success have you been seeing with with veterans? Excuse me.
Yeah, well, I mean, every course that I've taught, I see a majority of the veterans on the course start showing results by the end of the workshop, which is only 5 days long. You can actually see it in their faces. I'm going to give you many examples. A recent course I taught, a guy came in, and we had kind of the chairs just kind of sitting in a circle, and he came in, and he pulled his chair out of the circle against the wall, like he didn't really want to be part of the circle. He sat down, he was wearing a hat, he pulled his hat down tight over his head, closed his eyes, and just sat there. And he listened, but he didn't talk or engage or share anything. And then, the next day was a little bit better. He kept the chair in the circle, but still kept his hat pulled down and his eyes closed. By the third day, he shows up, he's not wearing the hat, he's keeping his eyes open, he contributed a little bit. The fourth day, he's talking more. By the fifth day, he was smiling and engaged with everyone. It's a transformation that is amazing to see it happen in such a short time. And I see that in every single course.
Well, I also sense, too, by the way this approach is that he was being allowed to be, to have that space to participate when he felt, I guess, confident enough to do so.
Well, this really is not happening on just a mental level. Mm-hmm. They're not changing because of what they hear. They're changing because of what they're doing. They're doing the practices, which is we do a combination. There's a little bit of yoga. There's some breathing practices that are called pranayama, but they're doing this unique practice called Sudarshan Kriya, and that's causing a change on a much deeper level, and that's why we see these kinds of results in such a short time.
Now, Jim, on our program, we've talked quite a bit about that when it comes to cellular memory, and it sounds like this is something that goes down into those levels, as you said. This isn't just about, dealing with the mental aspect, but it's also the physiological aspects and even perhaps the spiritual aspects as well, which you can see how a program like this is very holistic and integrative, which is different from what's been out there and available before for veterans.
Yeah, I think that's true. I came across a paper published by a psychiatrist who had spent his whole life working with the veterans and people who had experienced trauma. And I believe it was published in the year 2000, and the title of the paper was called "The Body Keeps the Score." And, the title really explains the whole paper. Because he had been working,
keeps the score in ways you could never imagine. 75 trillion scores, actually.
Yeah. So it was written by a psychiatrist named Dr. Bessel van der Kolk, and he had started working with the Vietnam veterans in the 70s, and by 2000, so he had close to 30 years of experience. And what he wrote was, when someone's had a traumatic experience, you can't change that by just talking to them. No matter what they might be willing to share or express, they're not going to get over it through that, type of methodology. And of course, the medications don't do anything to release it. They only mask the symptoms so that a person can function a little bit. Mm-hmm. But he said it's the body that keeps the score, and so you have to find a methodology that that is working on that, like you said, cellular level to release these impressions so that the person can kind of restore their normal functioning.
Sort of a way to release the triggers, with no pun intended, of course, so that way when they think of the memory, it really has no emotional charge anymore. Or
right.
pretty much a relief from it anyway.
Right. I think it's the emotional component that's getting stored, because any type of stressful experience, whether everyday life, you could be driving on the freeway and almost have an accident, and it scares you, and then that fear gets stored in you, and someone like a veteran who's in a combat zone is experiencing things like that every single day after day and month after month, and so it just settles deeper into the system. And so you have to find some way that's releasing that emotion. It's the emotion that's coming up. That's why you have outbursts of anger. Anxiety is really just kind of like a background state of negative emotion that's running through the mind.
Now, what do veterans have to say about this program? Have they been excited, kind of getting on board, kind of wondering, well, are you sure this might work? How has that been?
Well, the veterans, who take the course, they see the results just even in the first 5 days.
Mm-hmm.
And, they say things like their energy level is better, they're sleeping better, they're not having as much, outbursts of anger or anxiety. One thing I've heard, I think 4 different times I've had a Vietnam veteran say to me almost the exact same thing at the end of the course. They say, if I had had this 40 years ago, my whole life would have been different.
Oh, boy. I can only imagine.
Yeah. Now, some of the younger veterans who served in Iraq or Afghanistan, there was a Marine from Wisconsin who served in Iraq, and he just said taking this program gave him his life back.
Mm-hmm.
So he felt that after he came home, he just didn't have his life anymore. And I've talked to many of the parents of the younger veterans, and they say, well, after his first deployment, he was a little bit different, but he was okay. But after the second deployment, he just wasn't the same person anymore.
Mm-hmm.
So it seems the degree of time that's spent, in these situations, the longer you're there, the worse that it gets. I had a woman who had served in Iraq at a course I did in Rockford, and she goes, it not only helped me release issues I knew I had, but I was releasing things I didn't even know that I had.
Isn't that fascinating when you have something that can bring up stuff that you didn't know was there, but subconsciously and maybe on a superconscious level has been driving your life without you even being behind the wheel or even knowing you were ever in the car?
Yeah, I think everyone has at least a little bit of that, where things have been repressed, and we kind of bury it, and we never deal with it, or we don't do anything that's releasing that particular impression. Because you think, even early in life, all of us, when we're little kids, we start going to school. Kids are really hard on one another. There's a lot of rejection and humiliation, and children don't know how to deal with that, and it often just gets repressed. And this stuff accumulates throughout a whole life. The problem that the veterans have is that type of stress, you could call it, is just condensed into, packed into 1 year or 2 years of deployment, where it's like it's, probably equivalent to a few lifetimes of normal stress.
Well, also just imagine, too, that you come back from something like Afghanistan or Iraq, and perhaps the reception is, welcome back, but everybody goes about their day as normal, and you have this feeling that what you just did seems insignificant. Well,
there's a couple issues there. One is they don't feel like anyone who has not been there can understand.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes people try to you share, or they say, I can understand what you've been through, and they're thinking, you have no idea what I've been through. And they almost, can even resent people who, they're just trying to be compassionate, but, they resent hearing people say, okay, I understand what you've been through. They feel that the only people who know are the ones who actually went there. And so they shut down. They don't want to talk about it. They don't want to hear people say they understand. It's like they want to put it behind them, but they don't realize that, it comes back to that paper, the body keeps the score. They can't just do it in their mind and say, okay, I'm going to bury this and forget about it. I'm not going to talk about it to anybody ever. It doesn't work. I know, my father served in World War II, and the people in his generation, they had the same type of stress. They didn't call it post-traumatic stress, but, we know that they had that. And I think what they did is they just came back, and many of them just started drinking. I remember my father would take me, on occasion to the VFW hall, and really it was just a bar. And he'd take me in there. I was a little kid. I'd sit down next to him, and he'd, get me a Coke, while he had, drinks. And I remember looking around, and it was just a bunch of very quiet men, hardly anybody talking, and all of them are sitting there drinking. Mm-hmm. And this was the World War II generation. But obviously, that type of self-medicating, it doesn't help anything.
No, as you were saying earlier, even with medication, you're just basically masking the problem, but that energy's still sitting there. It's there and it's alive, and it's going to find a way to release itself one way or the other.
Yeah, and you have to do something. And it's the mind-body practices that is really the solution. Mm-hmm. Now, this is really ancient knowledge that that has been used in the East, to help people, to prevent them to keep accumulating this kind of stress. It's for everyone, but the veterans' situation is just much more acute.
Mm-hmm. Well, even more fascinating, too, Jim, just to touch on this a bit since we're talking briefly about history and the mind-body experience in the East, is even in the West, they had what was known as the warrior class initiations and rites of passage. So they had ways they could deal with this so that these warriors who would go out and battle could come back and be reintegrated into the tribe or the group, if you will. And to be successful, it's sort of like they knew how to instinctively shut the switch off, so to speak, whereas all of a sudden we just weren't doing that anymore.
Yeah, we have, when someone enters the service, they start with a boot camp basic training, but when they leave the service, there's nothing to bring some conclusion to help them go back into normal life. I think that's what's needed. Before someone leaves the military, maybe there should be a few months where they're winding down and doing some practices, rather than just say, okay, good luck and send them out. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think also our society, there isn't a strong connection or sense of community, for most people. I recently I met a woman who lives in the States, but grew up in Kenya. And it was so different than meeting the typical American. I mean, we had just met, and she's holding my hand, wanting to hug me, and just such a sense of connection and love. And someone who spent a lot of time, an American who spent a lot of time in Kenya, had said, this is what people are like there. She said, everybody is very close to their neighbors. Where I know I live many places where I don't even know my next door neighbor. And so when somebody comes back, from combat, they don't have an environment that's so conducive to helping them really heal and reintegrate.
Now, tell us, what is the Veterans Administration, are they on board with this? What are their thoughts about this? What's the future of this program?
Well, the VA and the military, in some places, is investigating alternative mind-body practices. So there's a lot of resistance still because the medical establishment hasn't fully embraced this type of alternative work, but it's making inroads, and I think the reason it is because what they can offer just is not effective for a large number of the veterans. The drugs that they don't want to take, they have too many side effects, and the counseling has a limitation on how beneficial it can be, and so there's resistance, but we're making inroads.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's never easy when you produce change to produce results, which it sounds like you're getting some pretty good results from this versus the old way of doing things. Yeah, but we feel kind of comfortable going this route, so this is the way we're going to go until further research is done. And it stands to reason with reasonable minds that, well, look, this is producing results. Isn't that what we're interested in here?
Yeah, I think that the medical establishment wants to see studies. They want peer-reviewed, publishable studies that have been replicated and show the results. But those kinds of things take time. Mm-hmm. And while some of this has been done, and the results are definitely very positive, it's not. There hasn't been enough study on a large enough scale where you can go to any doctor or psychiatrist and say, oh, well, this proves that these results are there. We don't have that type of evidence yet. We have more like pilot studies that are showing good results, and we just need to do more study. But we can't wait for all the studies, to prove, to give enough evidence that there's proof. We have so much anecdotal evidence that this is working, and nobody has a better idea. No one's come up with anything. So no, this is what works. This cures post-traumatic stress. That cure isn't there. Mm-hmm. And given that, then why not promote something that clearly is working for many, many veterans?
Now, is there a cost to veterans, and are families, are they allowed to take this as well?
Yeah, our program is offered completely free to the veterans, so there's no charge to them. And if they have a spouse that they want to bring, they're welcome to bring the spouse. And I've had many spouses on courses. Course I did last year in Rockford. There were a couple of wives that were brought onto the course, and these were mainly Vietnam-era veterans. And something I learned, as the men were sharing habits that they had developed after they came back from the war, turned out they were very, very common. I think you'd call them like obsessive-compulsive type of things. Little things, the way they check the windows and lock the doors, and compulsive things like that. And as it was coming up, and one man would say something, and another would say, "Oh yeah, I do exactly the same thing." Another one would say, "Yeah, I do that." And I was looking at the wife of one of the guys, and she's like, her eyes are just like opening, and at one point she goes, "I thought it was just you." She thought this was just her husband's problem. Mm-hmm. That, she'd been with him for 30 years and seeing this over and over again. Now all of a sudden she's hearing all the guys that were in Vietnam at the same time. They're having the same experiences, and so it helps her understand where that came from in him. Why it's happened, and I would guess it's going to help her deal with it more easily.
Well, I'd imagine, too, it would take someone quite a bit of stretch to believe that, that this is just not my only husband when we sit down for Thanksgiving dinner and you got to make sure the claymores are all ready before you carve the turkey.
Yeah.
It's been a pleasure to have you here on the program to talk about Project Welcome Home Troops. And if you could, Jim, is there a website our veterans out there listening today can find out more about this?
Yeah, so our website is projectwelcomehometroops.org. You can also use just the initials, pwht.org. So you can go to the website. We have some video there of veterans taking the course, talking about the program. You can find us. We have a page on Facebook. Now, I'm also coming to Portland next week, and I'm going to be giving a talk at the Dove Lewis Community Room on February 18th. I'll be giving 2 talks, one in the afternoon, which is going to be focused on veterans. So this would be for any veterans, spouses of veterans, or service providers of veterans. That's going to be from 1 to 3 p.m. On Tuesday the 18th. And then in the evening, I'll be giving a talk about how these same practices are used in the civilian population. Anyone who would like to learn some practices and start, having less stress and improve their life. So that's the Dove Lewis Community Room, and it's at 1945 Northwest Pettigrove in Portland.
We'll be sure to insert that information in our weekly newsletter, which goes out this evening, so people can be sure to be reminded of that as well. Jim, thank you so much for joining us here on the program today. That website one more time.
PWHT.org.
PWHT.org. Very good. Jim, thank you again for joining us here on the program today.
Okay, thank you, Daniel.
So there it is. Find out more about that and how you can perhaps reach across and help someone else or even help yourself by finding out more about how you can definitely relieve that stress by getting involved with Project Welcome Home Troops. We want to thank you for tuning in. This is the Beyond 50 Radio program. Be sure to visit us at beyond50radio.com, where we'll have some hot links up there for you to be able to find out more as well. I'm Daniel Davis. Thank you for tuning in. This is the Beyond 50 Radio program, and remember, live your day past.